Okay, thanks. Okay, so yeah, thanks a great deal, and thanks for putting me after Stuart, because that was a really fun talk, and I'm not talking about so many of those specific cases. So now you've really given a context. So I'm going to talk now in the abstract, but I will say the really one sentence version of that is Stuart talked about everything as a service. But one of the main things I try to communicate about making the governance of AI easier is thinking about software as a product and AI as a product, and then we can apply ordinary obligations to the manufacturers of products. So we already have a legal context we can get on top of. I also want to totally support what Stuart said about this being an immediate problem. I really think we need to solve this in sort of 2 to 4 years because of its impact on liberal democracy and the world order. And we've got to not only deal with COVID, but also climate change. So I do think this is a very immediate problem. So, whoops, and now I'm having trouble with the keyboard. Let's see if this works. Right, well, that worked. Okay, whatever. So I'm just going to give some definitions. These are not the only definitions of the words, but just to communicate quickly in these 10 minutes. All right. This is an old one, though. It's from the 19th century. What is intelligence? It's the capacity of a system to do the right thing at the right time. It's an extent. So it's a form of computation. It's not magic. It's not math. It's a physical process of converting the perception of context into action. All right, so it takes time, space, and energy. It's not that some country will suddenly discover an algorithm that spontaneously generates omniscience. That's not going to happen. That's not the context we're in. Okay, so people, when they're worried about AI, they say, well, that's not what I'm worried about. I'm worried about agency. But let's use a definition. Again, a normal, though not the only definition of agent, is that it's just a vector of change. The thing we really care about is moral agency. Now, moral agency is just a label for the thing we really care about. It's about who is responsible for their actions. And this is determined by a society. So some societies have different ideas about when you're old enough to consent to sex, when you're old enough to get married, when you're old enough to fight in a war, when you actually have adulthood. Some societies, you're not an adult until your father dies, which implies if you're a woman, you're never an adult, right? So this is something that varies by society. The other thing we care about, of course, is moral patiency. What are the responsible agents responsible for? Again, we have different ideas about this, although we also have some certain universal ideas, like babies. Everyone thinks that babies are an obligation of the society to try to keep alive. But even there's variation in what extent of resource people put behind trying to maintain their babies, although that's one of the most essential things. Infant mortality is the best predictor of state failure. If you can't keep your babies alive, you're in trouble. Anyway, those are all things you can look up. Go to the Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy or something. It's easy to find. This one is an implication I draw, which is not normal, but I think it makes this conversation a little clearer. This is that given that the moral agents and moral patients are defined by a society, that we can think ethics as a whole as basically that process of choosing the moral agents and moral patients, and therefore that implies that ethics vary by society. Now, people hate this idea because they want to say one society is more moral than another one, and I don't have a problem with that. Of course, we can claim that we're, like, for example, more ethical than we were before. I'm not being relativist here. But what I'm saying is that you need to then specify, for example, we're more moral, not just we're more moral, but we're more moral because a larger number of people have liberty, or there's smaller numbers of infant mortality, right? Things like that. So we actually have to give some kind of axioms, not just assume that there's an absolute ethics. We have to choose an ethics and then say who's more moral by it. And that also explains why people feel very strongly about, like, that I shouldn't start stripping my shirt off or something right now, right? We have a lot of identity indicators. It's not just about actual social order, right? So yeah, that's the implications of that societies need to hold themselves together and that we use a variety of means of doing that implies that laws will vary by things like, what is your geography? Are you a mountainous region? Who are your neighbors? What is your ecological context, as well as what is your history? What does your citizenry expect? So we have to expect that laws, as sort of an explicit form of ethics, are going to vary. Anyway, all of this stuff makes it much easier to talk about AI. Actually, going back to that first bullet, once you've agreed, if you have agreed that that's intelligence, then artificial intelligence is just a subset of all the things that act in a context that somebody intentionally built. And now here's where the governance makes easy comes in. I'm going to claim that that intent, the fact that it's an artifact, makes it someone's responsibility. Okay, so what is responsibility? Right? It's a property moral agents of a society assigned to each other. Okay, and that implies some kind of a peer relationship. And I'm going to come back to this, but so is trust. Trust and responsibility are relationships between peers. You know, it's something that we're doing a balancing exercise. We're trying to keep our society together. All right. Accountability is a society's capacity to trace responsibility, and transparency is the means by which accountability is implemented. So we need to be able to see who it was that was responsible for something, even if we add and create a more complicated situation. All right, transparency itself is never an end. A lot of us thought, oh, it's a good, we should just be trying to do that. But then you have this question, well, what is adequate transparency? For example, do you need open source? No, 2 million lines of code are neither necessary nor sufficient for real transparency, for people to understand the system, as was just beautifully discussed about how do we even know which apps we should be trusting, right? How do you communicate that information? So transparency has to actually be something communicative. And again, it has to be related in some kind of a relationship of hopefully openness. Anyway, trust relationship between peers, where the trustee is not micromanaged, but is allowed to defect, right? This is one of the tricks. That it's actually one of those things that makes it easier to keep a society together. Now, of course, hopefully you've got enough in common with each other that it's unlikely you'll get away with doing something too bad, but also allows kinds of slippage. I don't think it's a good idea for us to trust large, powerful agencies, right? Rather, what we want to do is construct a system that holds them to account, okay? That was a lot of motion very quickly, but hey, I only have 15 minutes and I want to talk a little bit with Stuart at the end. I hope you notice that these are the beautiful OECD principles of AI. We can stop building stuff now, okay? There's like 50 national governments that signed up to this. So like I'm like over principles. I worked on them for 10 years, I'm over. All right, but just point out that the 3 of them, I hope I have communicated clearly here. What is transparency, what is safety? Well, not really safety, responsibility and accountability, all right? And it ends a bit about the human-centeredness. Okay, regulation. I cannot stand it when companies say they don't want to be regulated. First of all, we're all regulated, right? We're just like, I am regulating myself when I breathe, right? Regulation is just perpetuation into the future. Also, most regulation by governments to the tech industry is positive regulation. We're pouring money and tax subsidies and stuff into our tech sectors. So it's insane to say we don't want to be regulated. So yeah, sorry, this is like a gratuitous gene regulatory network. Regulation, right? Simple. Governance is explicit, deliberate regulation, right? That's the stuff we sit down and do. And again, of course, companies are self-governing, otherwise they wouldn't keep persisting, right? They have to govern themselves, but they also are other governed. They're other governed not only by the governments, but by their peers in their sector and by other sectors, by their suppliers, by their customers. There's all kinds of forms of governance. Well, by the customers may not be as explicit, right? All right. So what we are regulating when we govern AI is not the micro details. It's not about, oh no, we can't use deep learning because that's unexplainable. No, what we have to regulate is how humans behave. They're the ones that are responsible, okay? So we need to worry about what they're doing when they build or they train or they test or they deploy or they specify. What do you guys call that thing? Procure? Yeah, there we go, the procurement, right? Those are the things we have to keep track of. And yes, as was mentioned before, in these immutable digital records, digital systems should actually be easier to have transparency for if we create a culture and enforce a culture of accountability, all right? So, and this is not only about making sure we have an accountable system. If you're a software company, you've been doing this for decades. For decades, we've had better DevOps than the average AI company has right now. And nobody knows why the AI companies are so sloppy. Because you want to keep track of these things. You want to keep track of the architecture of the system, why you built it, how you built it, what the inputs were, what the outputs are, what the different components are doing, where they're kept, right? Who changed things, right? Why they changed things, where you got the data libraries you're using, where you got the software libraries, were they actually cyber secure? Was that a good choice? If you're in the C-suite, you should be thinking about these things too, right? You want to document, log with secure revision control every change to the code base. And I don't mean you have to put like a message next to every character, but you know, there is again a culture of how much detail do you need. But basically, you should know who changed things, when, and why. So let's say, and actually the new version of Russell Norvig has this beautiful discussion of what really went wrong with the compass system. But let's say that really there was something that came out and was producing disparate outcomes for different races. And you needed to know, was that done accidentally? Was it negligent? Because now we all know to check out for this. So maybe 10 years ago, it wouldn't have been negligent, but now it is. Or was it actually deliberate? Did either the original procurers say, hey, there's certain people not voting for us, let's keep them in jail? Or you know, some bad programmer at the desk, or a hacker, right? If you have adequate records, you can go back and ask those questions retrospectively. All right. So this is, and then of course, you should log your testing, demonstrate due diligence, show why you released the system, how you made sure that it was still working when you thought it was working. And I really, again, I want to highlight and support Stuart's call for looking at these things like with trials, like with pharma trials, right? We're now realizing how much new social media can affect societies. We should think about these things, but we'll never be able to entirely anticipate all the impacts. So we also need to be able to do retrospectively and come back and say, okay, hold people to account and to get them to show if they follow good practices. So yeah, what is governing? Again, now this is what a government does. Well, again, it's the internal governance too. Select a problem, address it with some kind of resource, which is where redistribution comes in, stabilize and move on to the next problem. Okay, that was from a talk I saw by Landau, who apparently when the EU was 7 guys in a room, he was the French guy. So can we trust the government? Is the government going to solve our problems? No, of course not. As I mentioned before, you shouldn't trust things that aren't peers. It's another thing that we have to actually spend our time doing a good job and making sure it's okay to be us in a digital age, right? Modularity, nevertheless, is always useful. Government is one of the means by which we can make it easier as corporations to keep our sector fair, to stop races to the bottom, to make our own internal governance problems easier, right? And also to make sure we have the governments there to help make sure that our employees and our customers are well fed and well nourished and secure and you know and have a safe, clean society to live in. Again, another thing I want to highlight, and I have been highlighting for a while, I agree on this concern about genocide, and not just genocide, also by attrition. I'm worried about countries that think, oh, we have AI, it's going to produce all those productivity payoffs that Stuart talked about in his first slide. So we don't need to invest quite as much in healthcare as we used to, right? Not that I just recently lived in 2 different countries that cut the amount of money they were spending on healthcare. But the point is that there's all kinds of ways that we can move against people. And right now, it's being, like I just implied, it could be done through democracy, which may or may not have digital assaults. It can be done in anti-democratic ways. We're already seeing what, like 1/10 of Uyghurs are already in concentration camps. 65% of their religious sites, their mosques and their graveyards have been destroyed, right? That didn't take weapons, right? Not autonomous weapons. Humans with more technological power. We don't have to get to full autonomy to have this be something that needs to be governed. All right. Speaking of governments, which governments do you trust? And speaking again of China, I want to say this is disinformation, or misinformation at least, right? Somebody was sincerely, in fact, I tracked down the guy that's named here, Holger Schmidt. He didn't produce this slide. The data came from some work he had done. And he had made these original bubble charts of some companies that were that he'd heard of, or big market cap or something. And then he bundled them into Asia and the USA, which putting Korean and Chinese companies together as if they were like, I had the same control function is a little odd. But then somebody else comes in and starts talking about libertarianism and labeling this China rather than Asia, right? So with a colleague, Helena Malikova, we are working on examining just how true is this narrative. A lot of people are saying the EU has to back off and not regulate the United States because there's this big Cold War going on, and we ourselves have no capacity, and we just need to be backing the side we want to win. So we examined that a little more carefully. And if you have, like me, people's faces over the top of the bar chart on the right, you might want to drag those faces somewhere else because the right side of this chart matters a lot. What we're showing here on the y-axis is just in 2019, how many patents only in WIPO and only that were called basically AI patents. So it's just one category of patent. So we're being conservative here. So 2019, these are the companies that had at least two, all of them in the world, okay, that were basically AI patents. And then on the x-axis, this is the market capitalization. We included a couple of the companies that were in the top 15 that were not publicly listed, so they don't have any market cap. And then we looked at this narrative, is it just China and America, okay? And I hope you can see, especially if you can see this fourth category, of which Switzerland is a big part, incidentally, a big part of those that you see Hoffmann La Roche there, and there's like two other big Swiss companies. Yeah, no, it is not a two-horse race, and it doesn't look like, although both market cap and IP are problematic measures, but we're giving two somewhat disjoint problematic measures here and saying, no, it isn't just a two-horse race, okay? So that's all I had to say. Probably it's about 15 minutes, I don't know.